Carmen, do you want to go ahead and welcome everybody and then we'll do logistics?
Sure. Hi, everyone. This is Carmen Sanchez. I'm the lead for the Parent Center program here at the Office of Special Education Programs. And this meeting is for parent training information centers and community parent resource centers and those interested in the parent program. I'm going to turn it over now to Terry Marks to talk a little bit about logistics. Next slide, please.
Hi, everyone. This is Terry Marks. So I'm just going to run through some logistics that you'll see on your control panel. You're going to be muted for the majority of the webinar, but there will be times where various speakers may ask you to raise your hand and ask a question. So if you are looking at your panel, you should see a hand raise icon. If you raise that, that shows the speakers that you have something that you would like to say. We will then click unmute to unmute you and put you back on mute after your question is answered or you're done communicating with the speakers. There's also a link to captioning available in the chat, and there's also a handout around captioning in the handouts tab off to the side. And then if you have a question at any point, you can enter that into your questions pod and we will make sure that that gets over to our presenters. So I'm going to turn it back over to Carmen, who's going to facilitate the meeting for you.
Thank you, Terry. Again, welcome to the parent program meeting as part of the OSEP virtual project directors. I just want to let you all know what is on our agenda today and that there will be an opportunity for some discussion. So first of all on our agenda is Deborah Jennings will talk about the data that was received from you all in November across the network, and she's going to point out some important things about that data. Next, David Emenheiser will also discuss parts of the data and 3-year trends, as will Kristen Rhodes, another project officer here. And then Perry will then facilitate a discussion around some of the data and what that means for you and what you've been experiencing lately. I will then talk about an initiative that will be we will be putting in action for at least a year around really a focus on equity and making the parent centers voices for equity. And then we'll have further discussion about COVID and the current environment you find yourself in before closing at 3:30. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Deborah to talk about the parent center data collection and the results from 2019. Deborah?
Hello and good afternoon or good morning, everyone. I'm pleased to be here to be able to share with you the data from our 2019 Parent Center data collection. First of all, I want to thank each one of you for making sure that you got your data in, that you cleaned it up when we asked you to, and that we're now able to present the results. But before that, I just want to say, how are you doing? I know this has been a very challenging time, and I want to say that I'm very proud of each of you, each of my colleagues, that we are continually stepping up to be able to serve families and to serve children and youth during what is not the easiest time for many of us. Next slide. And we all know what that looks like. We're providing individual assistance and training for families and for youth. We're meeting with families, we're supporting families in these meetings. We're really out there doing a lot of outreach, and you'll see that in the numbers as well, that we're reaching out to communities throughout each of our states to make sure that families know about us and are coming to us to help them through their challenges in getting services for their children, infants, toddlers, and youth up to age 26. And also, we are advocates for systems change. We are making sure that the things that we learn from serving with families are being shared in the policy arenas in our state, local, and national level. Next slide. So every year, and this year was no different, we collect data from you in several ways. The first is that we collect what we call our data collection part 1, which is the quantity, the numbers of contacts that each of your centers have made with parents, with professionals, and with peers. And then we also do the program measure survey, which is where you reach out to parents that you've served and you ask them several questions about the services that they received so that we can find out what is the impact of the work that we're doing. And then together we report these results. As I'm going to go through these data, I'm going to go through it really quickly, particularly at some points, because some of it you'll hear more about in the OSEP project officers presentations, but you do have this complete slide deck, and it's one that you can use and modify for your own purposes and report your results in each of your communities and states. Next slide. So for the year 2019, which is October 1, 2018 to September 30, 2019, we had almost 1,300 contacts. That's contacts with parents, professionals, and with youth. This is over 120,000 120,000 increase in contacts over 2018. Next slide. And these are how the contacts looked in terms of individual assistance. We'll start there. So you'll see that there were increases in the number of individual assistance contacts for parents in the areas of phone contacts, email, and in-person. Clearly, letters are down across all of these groups because we are now not so much using the regular mail. We're using email and text to send out those communications. With professionals, again, we were up in terms of phone and in terms of in-person. There was a slight decline in terms of emails with professionals. And then with students, we had our major increases were in phone contacts, email, and text. And we know young people like to use text, and that's one of the main ways that we can reach them. And then also we had an increase in the number of contacts in person with young people. So we'll go to the next one. And here is that data in a pie chart. And it isn't really a significant change between last year and this year in terms of the percentages, in terms of email versus meetings versus telephone. We are still at a very high 50% of contacts are being done via email. And there was just the change was about 1% email, and with a slight decline in the number of telephone contacts. Next slide. In training, you'll see that we have also increases in just about every area. The only decrease was in terms of the numbers of students. But we should note that overall, we had a huge increase, about 13,000, almost 20% in the number of overall contacts that we've had with youth and students. We're at a total between training and technical assistance, individual assistance of over 70,000. And that is really significant because we're taking that charge of serving youth and really moving forward with it. So if we go to the next slide, we can see how we've had really significant increases in terms of the virtual attendance, where we increased from 65% of our training contacts in 2018 to 73% of our training contacts in 2019. And one of the things that we noticed was that across all of the parent centers, over 65% are using virtual training methods. And I would anticipate that in this next year, 2020 count, that we will probably see that number in terms of percentage grow as we've all been responding to the need to go virtual in the midst of COVID-19. Next slide. Now, you also provide us with data with demographics, and there's going to be some further discussion about the demographic data. And one of the things that we observed that there was not very significant change in terms of the disability categories. We can go to the next slide. In terms of the age groups that we served, there was not significant differences there, even though we do have there was a slight increase in terms of the ages 15 to graduate, again, which reflects our increasing focus on serving youth. Next slide. And then when we look at languages, the numbers for individual assistance by language and training contacts by language, again, we didn't see a significant increase in those areas, but those numbers are there for you, and there'll be some further discussion of that. And then the next slide is contacts by race. And as we will hear more about later, parent centers are truly the voices for equity, as we are really making some significant strides in terms of the percentages of individuals who are from African American, two or more races, Asian, Native American, and also Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islanders. And so we'll hear more about how those line up with the actual data from the census in terms of percentages. Next slide. When we look at meetings, one of the things that you'll note is that increase in meetings related to behavior, manifestation determination hearings, and a pretty significant increase in terms of the meetings that we attend related to suspensions and expulsions, in terms of the comparison from 2018 to 2019, and also an increase in terms of due process hearings. Interestingly, there was a pretty significant decline in terms of facilitated IEP meetings, and so it may be of interest to you to really find out what that means in terms of your state. I know in some states, the participation of parent centers, other advocates tends to be minimalized, and that a lot of times those opportunities for facilitated IEPs are not available for us as parent center staff members. And if we go to the next slide, again, we're making some significant impacts in terms of systems change meetings, with the number at the national level of over 1,300 systems change meetings, over 4,500 at the state level, and almost 6,500 at the local and community level. Next slide. Again, reflecting our greater use of virtual and internet web-based tools for training and individual assistance, you also will see that we're really using social media and also our websites with huge increases in terms of social media, and also huge increases in terms of the website page views, as being major tools for us in terms of disseminating information to families and also for outreach. When we saw the numbers for social media, we looked at it and we said, let's dive deeper into that and see what it involves and how different centers are collecting it. And so one of the things you'll see from us in the next data collection is we're going to have some clearer definitions of what social media counts and how you can collect that data. And we'll have available technical assistance on that so that we can make sure that it's consistent from parent center to parent center, because the numbers, we were seeing a lot of differences in terms of the numbers from center to center. So that's the information so far in terms of the contacts. And again, you'll hear more from the OSEP project officers. Next, we'll talk about our next slide, which is the program measures data. And in the program measures data, next slide, we look at, there are 7 questions, and there were 96 parent centers who contacted parents to collect surveys, and there were over 1,200 responses that you collected from parents. And if we go to the next slide, what you'll see is that 94% of parents strongly agreed or agreed that the information or support they received met their needs. And this is an increase of 2 percentage points over the 2018 numbers. You know, when we get into the 90%, it's kind of difficult to do better, but we're we did better again this year in terms of the impact on that question. Go to the next slide. Again, on the question as to their ability to understand the information that was received, we increased from 95% in 2018 to 97% strongly agreed or agreed in 2019. And those increases are primarily decreases in the disagree, the strongly disagree category, and that's exactly what we want to see. We can go to the next slide. In 2018 to compare to 2019, we're both at 94%, but again, you'll see that in terms of the information help parents to learn more about how to meet their child's needs, the percent who said strongly disagree decreased by 1%, and the disagree decreased by 1%. And so the agree is also decreased, and so that's why it came out to be 94%. But most importantly, the decreases that make up the total numbers are in strongly disagree and disagree. So it's still 94%, but we're absolutely doing better. Next slide. Again, we did better in 2019 in terms of parents' response to the information shared being useful. We're at 95% in 2019 as compared to 93% in 2018. And again, there was a decline in terms of the strongly disagree percentage. And we can go to the next slide, where parents responded they were prepared to use the information they received. 93% strongly agreed or agreed. And that is a significant change from 2018, where it was at 88%. And so you can see that the strongly agree increased by 5%, which is, I think that's remarkable, and that says a lot about how well we are serving families. And then the next question on the next slide was, do you feel confident in your ability to work with your child's school or service providers to meet your child's needs? And this is probably the hardest thing for us to be able to influence, is making sure that families feel confident. And it's something that we've really been working hard at in terms of improving those numbers. And we were able to finally get out of the 80s and 80%, and we are now at 90%, an increase of 5 percentage points over 2018. And then the last question on the next slide is, would you recommend this parent center to your friends or family? And we continue to have a high approval rate of 94% yes, 4% maybe, and only 3% at no. And last year, it was 4% that who said no. So again, we're doing a lot better, and parents are really telling us that our services and our supports and the information we provide are relevant, useful, and of high quality. Next slide. So these are just some questions for you to think about in terms of how you might use this data in terms of who needs to hear about what your impact is on families, and what are some ways that you can share these results, because it is important for us to get the messages out to families, to our partners, and also to our policymakers about how we are impacting the families of children, of infants, toddlers, children, and youth with disabilities. And then the last item on this is that it is time for the 2020 data collection. Next month, you will begin to receive the information that you'll need in order to start your reporting in October. And we want to make sure that we're available for your help. And so if you need help from us, please make sure that you reach out to us if you have any questions about your 2020 data collection or about the 2019 data collection. Next slide is just to say thank you to each one of you. I want to particularly thank the data collection team here at SIPR, and to let you know that we were really pleased last year that everyone participated and we got in the data that we were looking for. Thank you, and next slide.
So now we're going to look at the parent-centered data trends in the 3-year retrospective, and I'll turn it over to David to discuss the first part of that data.
All right. Thank you, Deborah. You can just go right on to the next slide. What we're going to do for the next few slides, Deborah sort of touched on a few of these, but we're going to look at the 3-year trend. And just to orient you to the next set of slides, the orange, if you're looking at a color screen, hopefully you are, the orange bar, which is on the right, is going to be the 2018-2019, so the data that Deborah was just discussing. The yellow bar, or the one in the middle, is the previous year, the 17-18 data, and then the green bar is the one from the 16-17. And what we're going to do with these slides is just sort of drill down a little bit on some of the data points, not all of them that Deborah covered, and look at those trends. So this first slide, we looked at who we served, and so you can see that there is in percentage a slight decrease of parents, a slight increase of professionals, and then the students, those youth, really took a, sort of hit a high mark last year, and then maybe just a little bit of a cut this year. Next slide. So how did the people attend? This is the in-person versus virtual. So you can see the trend line. Again, sort of that in-person during the previous year, the 2017-18 was a little bit higher. And so percentage-wise, the virtual was a little bit lower in that year. Next slide. These are the data percentages of how those services were offered. And you can see that somewhat some consistency across the years. Maybe a little bit of an increase in email 2 years ago, and that has remained. Next slide. We've already seen this slide. Deborah had it in a slightly different format, but this is the same sort of chart of how and who. So you can see the numbers, not just the percentages. Next slide. And those dissemination efforts, which Deborah talked about. The newsletter being fairly consistent, but there is a little bit of an uptick. Websites have just been a steady rise, and then social media just sort of exploded in this last year. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Kristen to keep talking about some of the other trends.
Thank you, David. It's good to see a bunch of familiar names in the list of attendees. I wish we could be meeting with you in person, but here we are. David had mentioned on one of the earlier slides the word consistency, and I think you'll see that theme as I go through the next set of slides, looking at this demographic information about the individuals that we are serving. So the first slide we have is the percent by disability category. And you'll see that generally it has been consistent. There's been perhaps some flip-flopping with the undisclosed and autism over the last few years. But in terms of the other disability categories, the percentages being served have generally been consistent. Next slide, please. Again, in the percent by age, it really looks like there hasn't been much change over the last 3 There's a little bit of variation, 1% or 2% here or there, but it's generally a nice looking bell curve if you think about it. So there hasn't been much change, and we're continuing to serve, seems to be the elementary school, or families representing the elementary school kids more than the other age groups. Next slide, please. And thinking about families served by race, Deborah had pointed this out earlier, that a majority of the individuals being served are Caucasian. And again, you'll notice a consistency across the 3-year period. And this slide is nice because we included census data from 2015, and you can get the sense of the national census in terms of the demographics of the country. Next slide, please. Ethnicity, this perhaps is the one slide where it is not necessarily consistent in terms of the not Hispanic and the undisclosed. There could have been, we've heard from a variety of parent centers that particularly a couple of years ago that some families were hesitant to disclose this information to them. So that may explain some of these patterns here. But if you looked at the Hispanic Latino, that has remained relatively consistent. Perhaps a little uptick in the most recent year, but generally somewhere in the 20-25%. And the next slide, please. And then in terms of language, we are around 80% of the families that we are serving are being served in English. And the other, Deborah had that nice slide showing the other languages that the family centers are using. So this, again, the word consistency just keeps coming to mind, just shows not a lot of variation over the last few years. The next slide, please. And with that, I am going to turn it over to Perry. And we are going to have a discussion on these areas. I think this is the point where we invite you all to raise your hand and unmute. And we'll follow the chat and questions as well. And then we'd like to discuss these topics with you. So go ahead, Perry.
Thank you, Kristen. Good afternoon, everyone. Almost afternoon for those of you on the West Coast, approaching soon. So we just wanted to have some discussion, allow for some pre-identified staff members from across the regions to talk a little bit about how these trends that we've seen just presented over the last several slides over the last 3 years, how they align with trends in your centers or not. We invite you to speak to any interesting tidbits of information relative to how or how not these trends align with what's happening in your particular center. So we have 2 questions here about the aggregate trends, and then also how might the data look the same or different for 2019, 2020, so kind of forecasting a little bit ahead. So I've kind of identified some staff members from the region, and we're going to begin with Region A. If the representatives from Region A, I believe Jenny and Luz, would you raise your hand to notify me that you're ready to share some information about trends and data within your centers? I see you, Jenny. Hold on.
Are you ready for me?
Yep.
Okay, well, the thing that came to mind for me was that there's been an increase in the sort of self-serve options for families. So the social media email, and virtual that all allow parents to do it a little more on their own timeline. For virtual, especially archived webinars or videos that we create that allow them at whatever time of day to watch. An email, unlike a phone call, can be returned on their own time, and social media can be used on their own time. So all of these things are sort of increasing and have been over, the last, I would say, 5 or 6 years. And I'm certain that if I answer the second question, it's going to be that there's an even bigger increase in all of these. The thing that I would love to have conversations about at some point are, maintaining accessibility to these. We have gone from very expensive ways to caption videos to finding some less expensive ways to caption videos. One of them is using a website called rev.com. It's a much cheaper way to caption, but also on data collection, because it's one way. They're contacting us not on our time. We may not have access to their demographics, but that also means we don't have a way to contact them again and share new information with them. So ways to sort of keep that two-way engagement going so that we can build relationships.
Thank you, Jenny. Could you just repeat the website? Was it red.com? Did you say red?
REV, as in Victor.
Gotcha.
And it's we used to caption live, no matter whether someone requested it or not. We then went to captioning only after the fact when we put them on our website, so the website would be accessible, so a webinar would be, and that was probably, I don't know, $500 or $600 a webinar. And rev.com is about $1 and change per minute, so much cheaper and very accurate.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing. We will move on to the next speaker in Region A. That's going to be Luz Hernandez. Is she available?
She's
Hi,
raised her hand.
Okay.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi,
Luz,
this
can
is
you
Luz.
can you tell us what parent center you're from?
Yes, I am from UNE, which is located in Philadelphia, Community Parent Resource Center. And thank you very much for having me the opportunity to speak today. I think some of the data that we were looking at goes hand in hand, obviously, with what we do with the nature of the Parent Center. But because UNE focuses in the Latino, the Hispanic community, we really see some of the trends, obviously, serving more Hispanic families, where other centers will vary according to the data collection that we have here. For example, in the youth and families served by race, we serve like 82% Hispanic, just to give you an idea, around 8% Black or African American, and 5% Caucasian and other. So our data does differ a little bit from what we see at the national data. Or not a little bit, a lot of it, quite honestly. But with that being said, it's the nature of what we do. And with professionals, that data is very similar to, if not almost the same. But one of the things that was really really caught my attention was that, with families, obviously in 2017, 2018, 2018, 2019, families always preferred, or mainly preferred, in-person contact. So they really wanted you to, either come to the office or go somewhere and meet them in person. And obviously with COVID-19, just to answer the second one, how that data look different, is that now we're doing things a lot more virtually with the families and or the professionals. One of the examples is the trainings. So with the trainings that we provided, people would come in person. We didn't have much in the sense of webinars or virtual trainings, a couple of virtual trainings. So in 2018, 2019, we were kicking off those webinars. In 2019, 2020, I should say, we're seeing a different trend, right? So it started out kind of the same. COVID-19 hit. We went all live. So we obviously all virtually. So we're looking at very different data at this point. We're looking at an increase in webinars, in online trainings, in meetings being attended virtually, IEPs, etc. So we definitely predicted that data will look a lot differently than what it looks like today. And another thing that, we also did as a result, and we had just done that at the end of 2019, which is we created something called Email for Education. So it was really getting those families that were using emails mainly for social media and really looking at using that email for communication with the schools and or with the professionals that serve their children. And that is something that we have continued to do virtually. So that would be an uptick, if anything, on really helping the families being able to attend those IEP meetings, et cetera, virtually, or help their kids with their education. So, but the trends that we saw were very similar to, and something that Larry said this morning that said, we have to really think about different, better, and equitable ways to educate our children. And that is something that, I think we all have our head wrapped around, if you will, and trying to figure that out in the best way possible. So thank you.
Thank you. That was very interesting and helpful to hear from the CPRC perspective and in terms of the populations that you're serving. So we will move forward to Region B right now. We have Rich and Joseph LaBelle. If one or both of you are available to share some information from your center and tell us what center you're representing.
Hey, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. So my name is Joe LaBelle. I'm the Director of Programs Impact at Family Network on Disabilities. And as I look at this data, I have to agree with Kristen. Consistency comes to mind as I think of year in and year out, the types of families that come to us with different types of questions, seeking support, the demographic trends that we see. I will say in Florida, we have definitely seen an uptick in serving Hispanic families after Hurricane Maria and Hurricane Irma a few years ago. We had a large immigration of families from Puerto Rico coming into the state around South Florida and Central Florida, which has been able to allow us to co-collaborate with APNI in Puerto Rico and really gear some of our resources into more of the vernacular for families coming from the island. One of the things as I also look at the way in which we're communicating, we talked about social media just a little while ago, and that kind of self-selection option, I think, is more critical now than it's ever been in the history of the parent centers. Social media and parents being able to access information on their time in the way that they choose to access that information is critical. As our CEO always says, our job is to step into the shoes of who is having babies now and who is having young children, and that is the millennial generation. And so we have implemented over the past number of years tools that will get information into the hands of families who are not going to call and who are not going to show up on our door and who don't want an in-person meeting. Those family members who feel more comfortable communicating on Facebook Messenger or tagging us in a post or texting back and forth. So it does not surprise me whatsoever that we see social media skyrocketing in the numbers. And I'm really excited to see some of the new definitions that will help us have some consistency across programming as we're pulling those numbers in. And I think that the data looking for 1920, obviously that's gonna look different in the way that we're serving families in the midst of the pandemic, working with and hand in hand with professionals. And I will be, I know here in the state of Florida, we've all had to shift extremely or completely online to a virtual platform for everything. But I'll definitely be interested to see how that data really lays out for the different ways in which we're communicating. I know that we have been doing a lot more video conferencing than email, for example. And people are not seeming to want, our collaborators are not seeming to want to do as much email communication as they do, hey, let's jump on a quick Zoom. Zoom has taken over everything. So how are we going to track those types of communications? So I just think the data will look unique and rich and very different for this year, given all the circumstances we're in right now.
Thank you for sharing. That's very helpful to hear your perspective on that. And so I would like to give. Do we have someone else from your center presenting, or is that just going to be you? Just to make sure. Okay. Let's move on to Region C. Leslie Gerard is up, and tell us which center you're representing.
Okay, hi there. Are you guys able to hear me?
Yes.
And Perry, I was asked to talk a little bit about school reopening. Do you want me to wait on that or go ahead?
We have a section coming up for school reopening, so we could punt till we get to that point for you.
Okay.
We're calling you then. Thank you. Let's move into Region D, and we have two perspectives coming from different centers in Region D. I'd like to call on staff members from TASC. Are you available?
Joy from Multicultural Families has her hand up. Do you want to go to her?
Sure. Joy? I see she's
Joy,
still muted.
Yeah. Joy, it looks like you self-muted. There you go.
Oh, okay. Yeah, thank you very much. So I'm very interested in kind of the data sets that you showed across national data, because Open Doors for Multicultural Families exclusively serves culturally and linguistically diverse individuals and families with disabilities. So our data set really is really the kind of the opposite of the like the racial demographic data as well as the language demographic data. And I'm just like to kind of pose a question of if we're thinking about equity, is the plan to match the demographics of the people we serve to the US Census, or should it be to match it to the disproportionate outcomes for students with disability? For example, African American students with disabilities and disproportionate outcomes in terms of discipline, exclusionary discipline, graduation, and all of that. Because we're seeing kind of across the board that schools and families for immigrant and refugee families need to find a way to just communicate in general as the first step to having conversations with schools. And so just like to pose that question to think about how we're going to prioritize those students of color in our parent centers.
Thanks for the question, Joy. We will talk a little bit more about the equity piece. Obviously, it's an essential part of the discussions and the thinking right now across a lot of our TA centers, including parent centers. Obviously, Carmen will be sharing a little bit more information about how we're looking at approaching equity within the parent program, and she'll share some more information as we get to that point. I think you raised an interesting question, Joy, and we can certainly talk a little bit more about it individually, you and I, as your project officer, as we move forward. So I'm going to push I want to give, I know that we still have TASK as well as PAVE that are slated to talk within addressing these discussion questions. So who wants to go first? Let's see. Okay, I'm going to call on you, Jennifer Cole. Are you available?
Jen needs to come off mute.
Hey, Jen, you muted yourself. You need to come off mute in order to talk. Okay, doesn't look like she can come off mute easily.
Hello?
There she goes.
Okay, can you hear? So sorry about that.
Okay.
Hi, thank you. This is Jen Cole from Washington State, and shout out to Joy from Open Doors for Multicultural Families, also in Washington State. So I was asked to give some comments about the data and thinking about how that lines up with PAVE's data. As the Parent Training Information Center for the state, we serve the whole state, and we have, just over 7.5 million individuals. And I think, to Joy's point, our data as a parent center, as a PTI, is, more or less consistent with our national aggregate data. Maybe there are a few differences, and I would probably note that those differences align with our outreach plans. So being really intentional about communities that we connect to, and maybe along the lines what Joy was speaking to, thinking about how do we address the disproportionality and systemic issues as it relates to special education if we don't focus on those students, particularly students of color, who have the most disproportionate impacts. So something that I'm thinking about for the upcoming year is related to our outreach. I do have some concerns about the shift to virtual trainings that has actually been, necessary to keep everybody healthy and safe. But then how does that impact our ability to connect to communities that really need this information? I'm thinking specifically about some of our rural communities that do not have great access to broadband connections. I'm thinking about our migrant communities through Central and Northwest Washington. And then I'm also thinking about communities where it's really important to build that relational trust, and that just becomes more challenging with trying to do things virtually when you can't be face to face, you can't share a meal, or you just can't see the other person to know what their body language is potentially communicating and whatnot. So I think in our next coming year, we'll definitely have an increase in our virtual trainings for sure. Our in-person trainings, that'll just be really challenging and limited by what's in place by our governor and our local health authorities. And let me just, I think that was, oh, and I think another trend we'll see is, with the technology that we've invested in and are increasing our capacity, we'll have more dissemination. I think that will be different for next year. Those numbers will continue to increase dramatically. We have a communication specialist who is very good with, looking at the data of who we're communicating to, and then also our collaborative partnerships, including with our state education agency, who also disseminates our information, just increases our capacity even more to reach families and students who have that technological ability to get online, to receive an e-newsletter, maybe get a text. But we still have an ongoing concern with reaching the hardest to reach. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Jennifer. Very helpful to hear the comments from Washington. And also some of your concerns relative to outreach. Thank you for sharing that information. I want to try and go back to TASC. Do we have a representative from TASC that's willing to at the moment? Matthew, Paula, Susan. I don't see anybody.
Hello, this is Matthew at TASC. Can you?
Yes. Go ahead, Matthew. How you doing? Matthew, are you there?
I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yes, we can hear you.
It looks like, sorry about not being able to get on earlier. I was having trouble with my.
No worries. No problem at all. Do we still have you?
Well, you still have me. And as far as the aggregate trends align with trends in our centers, it's looking really similar to what we're seeing nationwide. Because of our location in Southern California, we have a much higher percentage of Hispanic and Spanish-speaking families that we serve. Probably about 2/3 of the families we serve are Hispanic, and a little over 1/3 are primarily Spanish-speaking. And as far as how data trends are changing, there's obviously going to be some big shifts with the shift because of COVID-19, but so we're going to see a much lower percentage of in-person and a much higher percentage of virtual training. But other than that, hopefully, as long as we keep up our outreach and keep doing a good job with that, we're not going to see a huge demographic shift, because we're really doing our best to reach the most underserved population, same as we always have. And we've been seeing a pretty good response to that, especially in terms of Spanish-speaking families now being interested in doing virtual trainings.
Thank you, Matthew.
Thank you.
Sure, sure. I want to just go back and allow, if there's any particular TA or staff person from Region C that, or any of the other regions, if there is anything else you'd like to share relative to these aggregate trends, or the data looking the same or different that we haven't covered, that you want to point out, or just a comment you want to make relative to the discussion before we move on.
Perry, I see only Diana's hand raised, so let me see if I can get Diana to unmute. There you go,
Okay.
Diana, you're unmuted.
Hi, I actually raised my hand a long time ago because I had a clarifying question about the information in the PowerPoint presentation. So I don't know if it's too late to get it clarified now.
Okay, well, do you want to put in the question, and then we'll answer to the entire audience the clarification if you put in the question pod.
First of all, I just wanted to make sure that everybody was aware that the data trends, when you see, like in the who we served, and you see it looks like the orange bar is lower than the previous year, doesn't reflect a smaller number of people, just that reflects the percentage of people overall that were parents and professionals, and that's true throughout that whole section, which can be very confusing if you don't keep in mind always that it's not about, like, for example, Deborah said we actually served more students, but if you look there, it's a smaller percentage of the overall people served, whatever. So I just wanted to clarify that. But when you looked at the chart that compared the census data with the actual percent served, I think we kind of skipped over that those two charts a little bit, and I thought that would be, I think that would be an area that's ripe for conversation. And it goes to Joy's comment as well. So if you look at on the slide 37, where it says that the census data for 2015 says that about 18%, it looks like, of the population is African American or Black, and you see that the percent of the people that Parent Center served that were African American or Black is like maybe 15%. I think that's a conversation that we should be having, and I know we will be having it to some extent in the equity conversation. But
that's right.
I just wanted to draw attention to to those two slides.
Thank you.
Thank you, Anna. So it looks like we obviously did see some similar trends that really kind of align with the national aggregate data sets. It was obviously, great to hear the information from the CPRC serving Philadelphia region, and also hearing some of the concerns coming out of some of the centers relative to moving forward and moving more towards a virtual platform, and some of the concerns that could entail for certain populations in certain communities. So thank you all for that information, sharing that information with us. Carmen?
So we're going to move on to the next section because our time is getting a little short, and this has to do with the parent centers being a voice for equity. Can you go on to the next slide, please? So just for those of you, especially those of you who have fairly new parent centers and are not necessarily attuned to the entire history of the parent centers, which goes back now almost 40 years. When Parent Training Information Center started, they sort of predated in some ways IDEA. It was an attempt to get children with disabilities actually in the schools, to actually be educated. And it came out of that kind of advocacy background. A lot of the Parent Training Information Centers were developed by predominantly white, very middle-class women in their kitchen tables. And over time, it became clear that some of their concerns or some of the ways in which they might have approached advocacy for their children may not necessarily have spoken to the needs of other families who are not white or middle class or women, not necessarily the needs of dads sometimes. And community parent resource centers grew out of a movement to diversify the parent centers, to have a greater diversity of voices in the parent centers. So that's how the community parent resource centers were initially funded. Now, I think it's going on 25 years now, maybe closer to 30. And community parent resource centers continue to be a way of really getting to underserved populations. So we heard from Open Doors and all the multicultural families in Washington, HUNY, who serves North Philadelphia, but even, in rural populations, there are some centers that serve predominantly rural families. So that is where our parent center history came from. And now parent centers are oftentimes the voices at the state level or at the local levels to address systemic inequity. They see very much in the families that they serve, they see the needs of the families, they see the needs, the ways in which the needs of families who are not white and middle class may be overlooked, and therefore their children have, as we talked about, greater disparities in outcomes. So the parent centers have always been attuned to this and to see the kind of wide disparities in addressing equity issues. But in addition, there's been a lot of disparity and a lot of differences among the parent centers in how to address those equity issues. So over time, we've worked on very different kinds of things within the parent training and technical assistance centers. For example, we did some work around how to respond and meet legal requirements through email. We've done some work in the past about trauma-informed care. We've done lots of different kinds of work over the time with the parent technical assistance centers. And even before COVID-19 hit and really went to really highlight just how significant these educational inequities are, the project officers, we were all thinking that it's time that we addressed this issue of inequity and giving parent centers tools to address that. So if you go on to the next slide. So what we really wanted to do was develop resources, training modules. We're not really sure how we'll look because we really wanted to be responsive very much to the needs of the parent centers. But we think that the outcomes of this, of developing a Voices for Equity work group, and I'll talk a little bit about how we'd like it to be comprised and composed, we really wanted two major outcomes. We wanted the parent centers to have increased knowledge of systemic inequity and how to use their data to address the systemic inequity. Not just, as we were talking about, the fact that on the individual level, your data should look different because your data should reflect what's going on in your community. So of course it makes sense that in some CPRCs, their data is widely out of whack because their population that they're serving is the population that they're serving, which is not necessarily the same kind of national representatives sample. So not only is it a question of knowing your data and asking yourself, okay, if in my center, let's say 30% are African American, but I'm only 12% of the families who call me are African American, what does that mean? How do we get to addressing that? We want to be able to sort of address that kind of data, but we also want to be able to have parent centers address the data that they get from their states, the data that they get from the census, and to be able to really start working with the states and their local communities to address this kind of systemic inequity. And again, many of you are absolutely wonderfully fantastic at it. So we want to see if we can figure out a way of developing tools that will do that. And so then from that, as you have more knowledge of this kind of systemic inequity, more knowledge of how to use data, that we also have an increased capacities of you all as parent centers to do more effective outreach, the way Jen Cole addressed it, how to have effective initiate conversations on inequity that are effective and meaningful, and how to empower others, whether it's your parents that you meet, or many of you do, for example, you teach parents how to tell their stories when dealing with at the departments of education or lawmakers. So how do you empower others to create that kind of systemic change? So that's what we think the major outcomes of this work will be. And then some of these activities we think will happen is that we compile a lot of equity-related evidence-based practices for the parent centers to use and to make them really specific and useful to the parent centers, not make it so abstract or so academic that you can't do it in your day-to-day work. And that there will be a compilation and development when you compile the resources that are available of specific resources that are for the parent center. So those are some of the activities we hope will come out of it. We also very specifically don't want the work group to be very, very parent-centered driven. And by that, I mean that it is people who are in the parent centers, not the PTACs, not the technical assistance centers per se, even though they will be participating, that the parents, the people in the parent center, staff members are the ones who are leading the work and who are getting and asking for the kind of resources they need. So that's what we're hoping can happen. The timeline for this will be determined by the group. There might be some very low-hanging fruit that you can develop very quickly. There might be some work that will stretch out for longer periods. But in addition, I also want to stress that we're using the set aside, every parent technical assistance center, the SIPR and the regionals, set aside 5% of their funding each year to support work that OSIP identifies as important. So we have that set aside available, different amounts in different places to support this kind of work. To develop this work group and to support the work moving forward. So we're working with the regionals and with SIPR to identify who might be the right people to take on the work. But if you're interested, if you have staff member who you think would be really, really good at it, please talk to your regional PTAC and indicate that interest, and then we will see how quickly we can develop a work group. Because we really, like I said, COVID-19 has just highlighted what has been there for so many years. And we've always wanted to be able to tackle this. And it's just been a question of prioritizing it. But we really think that that the time is absolutely ripe to really do this work now, so that we can really have you be not only looking at your own center, looking inward, being more equitable in the work you do, but really being an even stronger voice for ensuring equity for all the many families that you serve. So that's what we're hoping to do. And I, we started this webinar and I just start going into the business, but I just want to say I've just been overwhelmed by the quality of the work during this historic time and how you all have continued to do the work. So I think it's really important that we continue to do that. I'm going to hand it over back to Perry so we can have a brief discussion, because it's only 3:22. It's already 3:22, about some things as you think about reopening, and maybe Leslie can then talk a little bit about some of the reopening issues, and I'll turn it over to him. So next slide, Perry.
Thank you, Carmen. So parent center needs during the pandemic, obviously, we will be in this operational state for the foreseeable future. And we're obviously trying to get a sense of what your needs are, as well as what are the needs of parents, families, and children that you're serving. So this is kind of an opportunity for us to provide you with some information, in that there will be a survey coming out from the regional PTACs to identify what kind of TA and support needs that you have relative to operating your centers effectively. That is soon to come. We will ask that you fill it out swiftly and get that information back in a timely manner. I don't have an exact date or time frame as to when that survey will reach you, but it is being developed, and expect to see that soon come across your desk, your email. And so next we want to have a conversation, some discussion relative to what families, and obviously we want to include parents and children in that. As Deborah mentioned earlier at the top of the presentation, there has been an increase, rightfully so, in serving children, serving youth within the parent program. So that obviously is a good thing. And so, we really want to have a discussion based on what are the needs of those families that you're serving right now, relative to the status of schools opening, and There's a lot of uncertainty still as it relates to that. It will look different, obviously, across states, districts, within states. Things are obviously still uncertain. I know that some states have started to obviously determine what that may look like. We're right up on the heels of some school districts reopening in some states. So obviously there's going to be a lot of information coming out relative to that, respectively to your own states and school districts that you work in. And that will have some bearing, obviously, on the operation of your projects, of your centers. But basically what we want to do during the time that we have left is to kind of get an assessment for you to kind of give us some information, some insights into what the needs are for serving parents and families during these challenging times. And we want to open it up, give you the opportunity, give you the microphone to kind of share with us what you've been hearing, what you've been thinking, also in terms of being able to bring in some of the information, some of the data that was shared, and being able to kind of forecast, or anticipate working in a virtual format for at least the foreseeable future in terms of dealing with the pandemic. So this is an opportunity for anyone to kind of speak to what they foresee, what they think. You may have had the opportunity to gain some of that information, and so this is an opportunity for you to kind of share what the needs are, what you think the needs will be for parents and families as we move into the fall. And we're going to open it up. Anybody can speak.
Carla Miller has her hand raised, so let me unmute her. Okay, Carla, you're unmuted.
I'm sorry, I didn't realize that my hand was raised.
Oh,
but I can just tell you that, the school districts in our state are pretty much all planning to open as usual, with giving parents the opportunity to elect to do either virtual or have their kids come back into school. And one of the things that we're hearing from families is just fear, because the districts aren't mandating masks, they're just recommending it. And also we hear from families a little bit of fear that, I will be judged based on my decision. If I don't send my kids to school, then I'm being an alarmist. If I do send my kids to school, then I'm not taking the COVID situation seriously. And so, I think that right now is the need that families have, is that the assurance that it isn't about a wrong or right decision. It's about what's in the best interest of your child based upon your child's unique circumstances, and working with your school district to determine what that's going to look like. But we are hearing that fear from families that they're that anxiety level is there for them. So that's kind of where we're at with the discussions here anyway.
Thank you for sharing that. I mean, that's obviously a real and vulnerable aspect of probably what a lot of parents will be facing as they make these difficult decisions of sending their children back into schools with kind of this heightened sense of a health crisis, for lack of a better term. So thanks for sharing that information. Who wants to go next?
Hi, everybody.
Go ahead, Leslie.
Okay, thank you, Carmen. Everybody hear me okay?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. You know, as I thought about this, I really kept thinking that I feel like I'm kind of in a state of flux, and I'm sure a lot of us are feeling that way. And so I actually looked up the definition, and it talked about that it's a state of uncertainty about what should be done, usually following some important event, which, you know, clearly COVID-19 has been a pretty important event in our lives. And then it precedes the establishment of a new direction of action. And so that really resonated with me as I looked, you know, at what our State Board of Education has been working on and what our State Department of Education and parents, you know, as we all try to kind of grapple what's going on. You know, our state recently came out with some guidelines, and our State Board of Education approved them. And on that very day, our governor expressed that she would be putting forth an executive order for school openings to be delayed. And then in our state, that will require our State Board of Education to approve that. So, I mean, again, we just, you know, families are faced with the same thing that our educators are faced with, and not really knowing what the future is going to hold. But I think that our message, you know, as parent centers, we just need to be very direct and clear and confident in our messages to families, because I know that as I listen to our Board of Education and our commissioner, I feel like we've had that clear direction somewhat, even in light of all of the unsettledness. So, you know, I think that, you know, our commissioner has talked about that families will have options and they'll be able to choose what's right for their families. And so, you know, we shouldn't, any of us, be judging the decisions of families, but we should be supporting them. So, you know, I think that as parent centers, we just really have to be part of the conversation at the table. I know I've been talking with parents and education leaders across the state. I've been listening in on all the discussions, and I'm sure many of you are doing the same, so that we're able to help families as best we can, and just really reaching those families that are going to need us most over the coming months.
Thank you. Thanks for sharing. I see we have Angela Lindig. You want to speak next? I see your hand.
Great. Thanks, Perry. So yes, this is Angela in Idaho, and I just wanted to add to that. I think a lot of us are feeling the same way. We're all concerned about what this is going to look like and what the options are. We're a state that has very much local control. While we do have guidance from our State Board of Education, our districts are, it is up to the individual districts to make the determination of what school is going to look like. And it is all over the board. We've got virtual options, hybrid models, brick and mortar, et cetera. I think one of the things that we're really concerned about in our office is the fact that we've managed to obtain some data over the course of this, thanks to some committees by the governor, as well as Idaho Business for Education. And that data is really giving us a lot of information about how many people, how many families in Idaho do not have connectivity. So over 100,000 families, they estimate, don't have any sort of internet connectivity, and another around 20,000 families who simply don't have access to any sort of technology or a device that would be suitable for their kids. So I think what we're looking forward to seeing is as school ramps back up in the fall, how are we going to now find those families if they do come back to the schools where they don't have access at home? How can we then, as a parent center, access them to be able to provide them the supports and the resources that they might need where they dropped off, you know, in the spring? We just lost them. So it's really our challenge right now to find those families and identify their needs and how we can help them in the fall. So.
Thank you, Angela. Important, very important challenge dealing with digital divide. I see that Ann Smith, you want to speak next? Your hand is up. You need to unmute Ann Smith.
Am I unmuted?
Yes.
Can you hear me? All right, thank you. Ann Smith, and I'm from the CPRC in Hartford, Connecticut, AvCamp, Advocacy for Children. Basically, I will definitely be in agreement with the comments that I've heard thus far. We also are in a state with local control, and our State Department of Education issues non-binding guidance. Not only do we have the challenge of different districts, but even intra-district, you can see a lot of variability around what's going on, what's being proposed in the different schools. There may be magnet schools that are doing one thing, charter schools that are doing something else. And so that creates some additional level of anxiety for parents. And then one of the areas that I know we are really concerned about is through this period of first not being in school, dealing with the health challenges, the severity of the COVID-19 infections and losses in your family, not being able to enjoy some of the activities that you are used to. We're really concerned about the trauma that our students are experiencing. And so that any component of deciding how schools are going to reopen need to ensure that those students who are returning, or even those students who are staying home, are receiving the kinds of behavioral and mental health supports that they need to be dealing with this. Post-COVID, whenever that is, we're going to be dealing with the impact of ACEs. These young people are experiencing multiple adverse childhood experiences, and schools are going to have to be able to deal with that.
Thank you, and very poignant conversations relative to trauma and the need to ensure that that is part of the calculation and really being supportive. I think Helen Fallon is up next. You still have to unmute yourself to speak. Helen?
Oh, there we go. Hi, Perry. How are you?
Good. I'm sorry. I think I mispronounced your name. Helene?
Oh, it's okay. It's okay, Helene. It's Helene Fallon from Long Island Advocacy Center and LIU. One of the things I just wanted to share was we created a community webinar that we had some of our students that joined us, for those of us a little bit older and maybe not so tech savvy. And we did the webinar on Google Classroom, Zoom, GoToWebinar, and we offered it for family, students, and professionals. And it was really quite amazing, actually. A lot of older teachers that joined in, but we've been now running it almost weekly, and I hope what we're hearing from parents is that it's been very helpful. But in addition to providing them the navigation on how to use it, we also provided them with of course, our resource and our numbers so that they could contact us if they were having challenges. So this was just one way that we tried to think out of the box a little bit and offer something that seemed to be necessary. We have the same disparity here in New York. It's unbelievable, the difference in the amount of people that do not have access to tech or connectivity. But one other thing was we have been working with our federal tech project. Here in New York, it's called Technology Related Assistance for Individuals with Disabilities. And there are projects all over the country. Every state has one. And one of the deliverables in those projects is to loan assistive technology. So we were able to get about 24 Chromebooks loaned out to families. And I know that's a very small number. It is 24 people that then had connectivity, and that might be something that people want to look into. Again, it's the 8 Act. If they Google it, and the federal site should come up and tell them where in their state the project is run.
Very nice. Thank you. Thanks for sharing.
I think given the fact that we're 10 minutes past the hour, I think maybe we need to stop here. Those of you who, you can go to the handouts and you can download the PowerPoint, and you can look at the PowerPoint in more detail by looking at the handouts. I also want to stress that this is going to be recorded, and it has been recorded, and will be available on the SIPR website as soon as we get some closed captioning and the rest attached to it. The last few slides, again, since we're over time, I won't necessarily show them, but the last few slides remind you that in terms of coronavirus, that there's a whole suite of resources available on the SIPR website, and it tells you how to look through those resources and how they're divided, so that it's not, like Deborah will often say, it's not like drinking through a fire hose, but you can manage some of the information you have. If you come across things and resources that would be helpful to all the parent centers, do send it on to SIPR, and they will then think about how to put it on the SIPR website to share with everyone. So I think that's an important thing that we wanted to highlight. And then again, we cannot stress how much not only COVID, but of course the protests in the wake of George Floyd's murder have made it just so clear the kinds of racial disparities that are in this country. So if you are very interested in the equity work, please reach out to your regional PTAC as we put together that group. And last but not least, there's a lot of comments here. There are more comments because we're running out of time rather than questions in the question box. We'll do what we can to compile them, and again, send it on to management as we have in the past, so they can hear directly what it is the parents are experiencing. So with that, I'm sorry, Deborah, I'm going to cut you off in terms of going through the coronavirus resources. You see it up there, and again, download from the handouts before you get out of this webinar, so you can have the PowerPoint directly and you can go to it. So thanks again for everybody for participating. Thank you for all your work, and for just keeping on and making us all aware of how important it is to serve the families we serve. Thanks again. Have a good day.